we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone out there. Thank you so much for joining us today for our third session in this webinar. My name is Amy Nin. I'm the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Clever, and we are really thrilled to be hosting this series in partnership with some really wonderful collaborators. Just to give you a sense of, this series and what we're hoping to do. So at Clever, we are dedicated to advancing conversations on how to make edtech products work better for all students. And working with a lot of edtech providers over the years, we've discovered that we share a commitment and passion for product inclusion. And so this month, we are hosting a series of webinars, about 30 minutes each, dedicated to product inclusion. We've already hosted 2 in-depth discussions so far with EdTech leaders, and we have 2 more left in our series, which includes today's conversation on building product inclusion in content and tomorrow's session on understanding co-design methods and practice. You can see all of our amazing speakers on the next slide from our series so far. And so really encourage you to join the final session tomorrow if you can. As for today's agenda, so I am going to, and this is what we have today. We are going to be discussing creating inclusive edtech content with Dr. Chastity McFarlan. So we will go ahead and get started in a minute, just to share a little bit more about the agenda. So I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker here in a minute. We're going to have a discussion around what does it actually look like to create inclusive edtech content. We will have some time for question and answer. So if you have a question, go ahead and use the Q&A function to share your question, and we will try to get that answered in the time that we have. And then we'll talk about what's coming next. So that's what we have on tap for today. But to introduce our speaker for today and our expert around product inclusion, Dr. Chastity McFarlan is the Director of Content Quality and DEI at Renaissance Learning. She leads Renaissance product inclusion strategy, working across teams to ensure content is appropriate, inclusive, and representative of the students we serve. Prior to joining Renaissance, she provided technical assistance to charter school authorizers across the country and evaluated academic programs of charter schools across New York. She earned her PhD in developmental psychology from Howard University. So thank you so much, Chastity, for being here. We really appreciate it and are excited to hear more about some of the insights that you have. Again, if you all have questions, please go ahead and drop those in the Q&A function, and we will get to them. So to start, Chastity, just tell us a little bit more about your role at Renaissance and what that looks like.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I lead our vision and strategy for ensuring that students have an inclusive experience when they use our products. So for the most part, that entails me working with content, product, and engineering teams to ensure that all student-facing material is appropriate, it's inclusive, it's diversely represented. And this can include assessment items and passages that you'll see in STAR and DNA. This includes books in Mayan, articles, and even the avatars that you see on Freckle. Anything that the student sees, we want to ensure that we have, we put an inclusive lens in creating and building it. That's the majority of my work. Along with that, I also work alongside marketing and sales teams to make sure our messaging is consistent and we're implementing the same inclusive practices in our customer-facing content that we are doing in our student-facing content. And most recently, I joined our AI committee, which is very exciting. So I review project proposals that involve generative AI. And my role is specifically to think about responsible AI practices and making sure that we're not causing any harm and there's no bias in any content generated from AI.
I love that. And I love that Renaissance has a role dedicated to this, especially as a content provider. It feels, I think, really critical to think about all the ways in which you could maybe cause harm with content, and how do we ensure that we're actually creating things that feel representative and inclusive, to your point that you mentioned. So I love that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the philosophy that Renaissance has when thinking about and using inclusive edtech content?
Yeah, so our philosophy is that our content should provide students with windows and mirrors. So we think that students should be able to see themselves or aspects of their identity reflected back at them when they are interacting with our content, sort of like a mirror. And they should also have the opportunity to learn about other people from different backgrounds, different places, different cultures, sort of like looking into a window outside the world. And in both of those instances, the content, I'll probably say this at least 5 times today, the content should be accurate, uplifting, and empowering anytime we are representing different groups.
That is really powerful to think about, this idea of windows and mirrors. And I've heard that, I feel like I've heard that, I was a teacher at one point and have heard that in my time through teaching and in the education world. And I just really appreciate that you're applying it to how we actually think about the content that we as an ed tech provider put out. So what does this actually look like in practice? You shared windows and mirrors and the idea that content should be accurate, uplifting, and empowering. Walk us through the process of how you develop inclusive content.
Yeah, so when we think about representation, we consider both quantity and quality of representation. So for quantity, we're thinking about to what extent are we representing different groups? Who's underrepresented, who's overrepresented? How does this compare to the population? What population are we even comparing it to? All of the quantifiable metrics that come with representation. But we also, and probably more importantly, think about quality of representation. So how are we representing these different groups? Yes, we want it to be, again, accurate, uplifting, and empowering. So how are we making sure that we do that in our content? Just as some examples or questions that we ask ourselves that come up often, are Native Americans, for instance, only discussed in the context of colonialism? Do we only represent people with disabilities when we're talking about a disability, or are they also represented in other contexts that have nothing to do with their disability? Are men ever seen as the primary caregivers, or is our representation of people from single parent households or economically disadvantaged neighborhoods asset-based representation, or are we focusing on what they lack when they're mentioned in our content? How would a student feel when they see their story represented in our content? Do they feel a sense of pride or shame? So it's not enough to have representation of these minoritized groups if that representation isn't high quality. So we're always thinking about not just having more quantity or having more representation. We want to ensure that it is hitting the mark when we do it.
Yes. And I feel like if folks did not hear the questions that you shared around what you think about when you think about high quality content, I would definitely note those down. I think those are some really important and critical questions to be asking if you're a content provider. You talked about both the quality and the quantity pieces. How are you balancing those when you're looking at inclusive content?
Yeah, so we are at a place now where we can think about both at the same time. When
Okay.
when we first started, we had to prioritize one at a time. So we started with what I would consider the baseline for quality representation, and that's content appropriateness. So we had a set of content appropriateness guidelines across Renaissance. And then we also worked with each product team to develop product-specific content appropriateness guidelines. And these guidelines call out what not to do in content. How do we avoid bias? How do we avoid content that may harm students? How do we avoid perpetuating stereotypes? So they call out, use this instead of that, or don't refer to this group of people as A, B, and C for this reason, really focusing on what to avoid. Around that same time, I also began reviewing our content or the complaints and concerns that we would get from customers, but only those related to content appropriateness and inclusion. And I did a bit of a thematic analysis just to see what are we hearing from customers in terms of where we can improve. What are some of the overarching themes across our products and between our products as well? So that was sort of phase one, just focusing on the quantity. I'm sorry, the quality. Then phase two focused more on quantity. We set some targets, and initially every product had their own set of targets. Some used census data, some just wanted to increase representation with no end sight in mind. We aligned on the K-12 public school population as the ultimate target that we are trying to reflect in our content. And then began our audit. And that was probably the biggest project that I've launched at Renaissance. I've been working with a data scientist to build out some models to analyze the text in our content for representation of different groups and subgroups of people. And that's an ongoing project because we're continually adding more content to our products. But the goal here is to quantify representation so that we can have an understanding, again, of who are we overrepresenting and who are we underrepresenting, and based on that information, adjust our content strategy accordingly. So now we're in this next phase where, okay, we know the groups that we are underrepresenting. We know to what extent we're underrepresenting them. We know we have to increase representation. And we have to make sure that as we increase representation, we're doing it in a way that's positive, it's accurate, it's authentic, it's told from their perspectives. So we're focusing on both the quantity and the quality of representation now.
I think that's such an intentional approach, right? And you're also kind of sharing that you didn't do it all at once, and you have to start somewhere. And so what is that place to start? And it sounds like it's kind of focus on the quality piece first before even thinking about increasing the actual representation. So I really appreciate the intentionality there. And I think one thing that you've been bringing up in our conversation is how to not have content that can produce harm, especially to students, right? And students who are in the classroom, like they are taking in this curriculum almost potentially every day, and that can have really profound impacts. So how do you all at Renaissance identify and address harmful or stereotypical content during the content creation and review process? What does that look like?
Yeah, so the content creation process, I spoke about the content appropriateness guidelines, and those focus on, again, what to take out. So they get into some detail about what is considered offensive generally, and then for specific subgroups as well. What do we want to avoid? There's a really big emphasis on what are we taking out to identify anything that's harmful. We're also working on content inclusion guidelines. So if the appropriateness guidelines are like a 101, the inclusion guidelines are like a 201, where now we focus on one group at a time, and we do thorough research, secondary research online, but also primary research, interviewing different folks, just to understand what are the ways that they want to be represented in our content. How would they tell this story that happened to their people? And we're starting those for each group, and they're living documents, so they're intended to be we'll always add to them, but they're intended to come together to be this like rich set of resources that our content teams can use to, whenever they are trying to write about a group of people that come from a different background than they do, they have some reliable information, and they know how to navigate that process. That's the creation process. Well, as far as the review process, we try to make sure that all of our products undergo a qualitative review for inclusion. So I do lead a content quality advisory council. That's an external advisory board. And we get together quarterly, and we do in-depth reviews on our content with an eye for inclusion. and specifically, how do we make the content more inclusive? So we have some conversation about, great job, keep this going, but the bulk of it is how do we go a step further and make sure that we're even more inclusive than what we're doing right now. I also lead a product inclusion working group that is internal to Renaissance. So that's, it's a volunteer-based group. Right now, it's mostly content team members. And we meet monthly and we discuss, challenges that they're facing. We come up with projects that are already aligned to their roadmaps. They're just trying to see how they can apply an inclusive lens to work that's already being done. So trying to make sure that it's like a key ingredient and not just the sprinkles on top, if you will.
Right. And you can't do it all on your own, it sounds like too, right?
Oh.
You are one person. And so, so what does it look like to partner externally, but also across the organization to really make product inclusion a reality, especially because, there's probably so many different facets of, your product and what that looks like for each of the different products that exist. So I really love the idea of, how do you bring in the right stakeholders? Can you share a little bit about, what insights the stakeholders you work with, whether external or internal, have brought to the process that help you refine your content more?
Yeah, so the advisory board, the Content Quality Advisory Council, it's about 5 to 6 members on that council, and it is intentionally diverse. So I don't think any two members have the same racial background, as an example. But it's also diverse in terms of professions. So everyone generally works in education, but some are teachers, some are researchers, administrators, etc. All have some experience with diversity, equity, and inclusion matters as it relates to education. There's also diversity in terms of religious beliefs, in terms of geographic locations. So try to make it as diverse as possible. And as a result, we see that they bring in their perspectives and their lived experiences when they are reviewing our content. And it helps us in terms of thinking about things that we just generally didn't consider because we didn't have that lived experience or that wasn't our perspective growing up. So it's really important that they have the time to just do that deep dive and that they feel safe to challenge us and challenge our thinking. Some examples that come to mind are, so we had this one member, she was a Native American woman, and she was reading about she was reading passages about historical events that impacted Native American communities. And she called out that we have to make sure that we're not representing this group as victims and as being powerless because of what happened, but instead as being brave and resilient despite what happened. So we can talk about the same, we can talk about this subject, this event, but it's the perspective that you are bringing when you're writing about that content that is key. So that when a Native American student is reading it, again, they feel that sense of pride and not shame. They also pushed us to ensure that we have diversity in the voice actors that are voicing students through our products and making sure that Black people aren't overrepresented in urban neighborhoods when we represent them. So it's different things that, as you're just writing out content piece by piece, you don't really notice the trends across the content or across the product. So they really provided a lot of that great insight from their perspective.
Yes, yes. And I want to make sure we start moving to some audience questions. So this one is not in the Q&A function, but I do want to make sure we do cover it. It sounds like, to set something up, it can be a whole process, how to operationalize it, how to get the folks on board. And so can you actually just talk a little bit about how you concretely operationalize something like an outside or external group to review content?
Yeah, so when you, okay, and just to make sure I understand the question, when you say operationalize it, are you referring to the processes, the standards that I put in place to make sure that it's running efficiently?
I think I mean more like, how do you even make that happen? Like, who do you, how do you even get a group of folks together to do
Hmm.
that? And, how do you make sure that they are, how do you make sure that they are, that their time is well respected and that they're able to, take time out of, whatever
Hmm.
they do to come to this. So yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah. So there's a lot of pre-work involved in terms of setting up a charter and making sure that you think through everything that you want them to participate in, so that on the front end they have a good sense of like the time commitment to start off with. But in terms of like recruitment, I reached out to we have NAAs, National Academic Advisors, and those are our academic experts at Renaissance. So I started there in terms of, hey, do you know anyone in the field that is really devoted to DEI in education matters that would be willing to do this? We also post to LinkedIn and we reach out to our networks,
Mm.
and making sure that, again, there is diversity and thought in terms of who we want to be on this board. So we'll have someone from a Catholic school, we'll have someone who is in research, we'll have someone who is currently in administration. We try to think of all of the ways in which um, this would, and all of the ways in which someone's perspective may be needed in
Mhm.
our content. Understanding, of course, that no matter how large this advisory board is, there's always going to be some identities that are not reflected, especially when you start thinking about intersectionality. But to the extent possible, just keeping an eye on who we are recruiting and who we may be missing for our content. I think moving forward, especially now that we have the audit in place, and we see the different groups that we are potentially underrepresenting, and we'll be focusing more on representing those groups, we'll want to have those perspectives on the board so that we can just check our work as we move along.
Yes. Thank you for more details on that. Hopefully that was helpful to some of our audience members out there. So we have a question from Jeffrey who asks, have you been able to use AI to detect potentially biased or harmful content? And have you been able to use AI to access inclusion in the content?
That's a great question. And actually, the reason that I ended up on this committee was because I was working with the team and they were trying to produce passages. And I figured, is there a way that we can lead with an inclusive lens, or if we can use the work that we're doing to increase representation, if we can use AI to do that? The short answer is no. Initially, when we started, it led to some, it wasn't harmful content that was generated by AI, but it was like borderline cringy, just, kind of stereotypical, and it just didn't meet our expectations. So we ultimately decided not to use AI, or at least this was about a year ago, not to use that particular software to develop content with the intention of increasing representation and inclusion. So we'll use it for more fact-based
Mm.
articles and passages. And then, of course, it's our policy that there's always a human in the loop when anything is involved, when AI is involved with anything. So we want to make sure that at the end of the process and even throughout the process, there are a set of human eyes on the content that's being generated to ensure that there is no harmful content or bias. For our audit, we are using machine learning models. So we started off by building out dictionaries that sort of crosswalk different terms and names to the different groups that we are interested in monitoring. And we use Wiki API, we use like different sources to build out these models. So there's some machine learning there. And even then, there are humans on the back end reviewing the output to make sure that it's accurate. So excited about the potential of AI, still skeptical, but a healthy skeptical.
Yes. Yeah, and I appreciate the balance, right? It's like, AI is so powerful, and I think we've seen how powerful it can be. And sometimes when you're thinking about bias and when you're thinking about how to even screen for bias, right? Sometimes it is imperative to have that human kind of touch point to it. Because AI is only trained on algorithms and things that they already know, right? And so sometimes the nuance is required from an actual human.
Yeah, absolutely. And the example that comes to mind, and we checked this recently and it doesn't happen anymore, but we were just trying it out with ChatGPT. And we said, create a passage about a middle school student getting ready for a dance at her school. But like we varied the middle school student to, a middle school student who is Latina or of Mexican descent specifically. And when we did that, every time a passage was generated, the student's name was Maria. And that's something that on first glance, you wouldn't think twice about, but after a while, you start to notice that there are some stereotypes within the generated content. And at surface level, it will pass your guidelines because it's not harmful in any way. But that doesn't mean that there is no stereotypes that a human wouldn't be able to pick out.
Right. Yes. That's a great example. So thank you for sharing that. I think we have time just for one final closeout question here. So what's on deck for the future around continuing what this work looks like?
Yeah, so we focused a lot on representation and cultural relevance, if you will. I think the next step would be broadening that a bit to cultural responsiveness. So we know from years of research that our culture, the way we were brought up, it impacts our preferences. So it impacts our preferences for communicating, impacts our preferences for learning and demonstrating what we learned. And all of these impact our educational experience. So if we want to build a truly inclusive experience, then we have to factor in these preferences that vary from culture to culture into our product features and functionality. And what that looks like is still TBD. It requires lots of research and understanding who our customers are and how they prefer to demonstrate their mastery. But I truly think that that's the next step in building a truly inclusive product.
Yes, and I can't wait to keep in touch and hear more about how that goes and how your thinking evolves there. We are at time, so want to be respectful of our. I know, literally 30 minutes just moves and flies by super fast. Thank you, folks, for joining us. If you have 30 seconds, please give us some feedback. That is in the resource section. You'll also find some resources from Chastity and Renaissance in there as well. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, everyone. Please join us for tomorrow's session on co-design methods in practice. So please join us. That is our final session of this series. We really appreciate you. And thank you, Chastity, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone.